Welcome back to Frameworks. Today, we're going to go deep on a topic I believe is misunderstood, undervalued, and often underlooked, and that is aerobic work. Take VO2 Max. It's a useful indicator of fitness, yes, but too many athletes and coaches have turned it into the goal itself. Chasing VO2 max at all costs can lead to diminishing returns. It can come at the expense of recovery, longevity, and total system health. I'll explain why and what to focus on instead. Aerobic work alongside resistance training forms the foundation of long-term health and performance, and in this episode, I will share the simple definition of aerobic training every coach needs, the two key types of aerobic work, and what you must use, a structured framework to assess, program, and progress aerobic work, and why aerobic work doesn't just benefit performance, but impacts recovery, stress, mood, cognition, and resilience. I'll also talk about how chasing measures like VO2 max can lead us down a path of no return. And if you want to design aerobic programs with intention and stop just doing cardio, this episode is definitely for you. So now let's get into it. All right, let's get into the episode. And today we're talking everything aerobic. And quite frankly, this has been one of the most interesting topics of conversation for me over the past decade or so as it relates to program design specifically. Not that strength training or strength programming for strength or hypertrophy or muscle endurance or any of those things is unbelievably easy for every person, but we have principles and we can stay pretty close to those principles and it works most of the time. I got really interested in energy systems training probably about a decade ago, and I was introduced to just a different way of thinking about energy systems training and aerobic development specifically through James Fitzgerald. And he opened my eyes to a lot of things, a lot of variables that were independent of things like heart rate or, time per interval or 500-meter row, or whatever the case was. And I dug down a very, very deep rabbit hole. And going through that rabbit hole, I read a book by Dr. Kenneth Cooper. And this book was written way back in 1968. And the book is called Aerobics. So if you haven't read this as a coach, I absolutely recommend that you go back to the late 60s and read Dr. Cooper's book. And he was one of the first ones, if not the first one, to define and let's just call it define polarized aerobic exercise as a structured practice for improving cardiovascular health, stamina, longevity. Right now, we're kind of going full circle and talking about that again. And he really focused on the idea of quantifying aerobic work to prescribe consistent rhythmic movement for overall well-being, not just performance. So really interesting book. Highly recommend if you haven't checked that one out to go ahead and check that out. So dug down this rabbit hole, and like most things, guys, as we talk about building frameworks around concepts and ideas, sometimes we have to go down the rabbit hole to come back full circle to okay, keep it really simple and let's just focus on the principles. And that's what we're going to get into in this episode. So number one, I want to be really clear on something. The way that I'm approaching this conversation is that aerobics are vital for health, longevity, vitality. Let's call it vitality overall. And resistance and aerobic work, they're 1A, 1B in long-term health, in my opinion. I'm not putting resistance over aerobics, and I'm not putting aerobics over resistance. I think they complement each other really, really well when we start looking at long-term health, and I'm going to lay my case out over this podcast. And another thing that I want to conceptualize as we dig in is to that pyramid analogy. And I've heard many people use this analogy, and we've used it for many years, and Peter Attia actually used it really, really well in either a podcast or his book Outlive. I'm not sure where I saw or read him talk about this, but it was clearly people understand what this pyramid idea really means, or this pyramid analogy. And we actually talk about it a lot in our facilities at Proof 3 and how we develop aerobic training inside of the gym and how we convey that simply to our people. So what this is that we have this aerobic pyramid, and the intention or the goal is to build this aerobic base, or the base of that pyramid, really wide before intently focusing on building the pyramid really high. So we would call that intense aerobic work. We'd call that more interval based faster cadence aerobic work. So essentially the idea is let's get that pyramid as wide as possible. And then that is a really, really solid foundation to then build capacity on top of it. So another thing that I need to hit before we actually jump into frameworks of the episode is this concept of VO2 max. Okay, so this is something that I've wrestled with over the years, and I think we talked about it last week. I talked about us as coaches. We really like to have these objective measures that we can look at because it just makes our jobs a lot easier. And VO2 max is one of those things. If we just have this number on a piece of paper, we can quantify where someone is in terms of cardiovascular health. So VO2 max is definitely a solid correlative marker of cardiorespiratory fitness, which is highly associated with decreased all-cause mortality. And you'll hear a lot of these longevity folks on YouTube and podcasts that they'll really focus highly on VO2 max, and they're doing it for a good reason. I'm not saying that they're wrong to really focus on it, because there are a lot of correlations to a decrease in all-cause mortality or just living longer. But this is where I'm going to come from, and maybe I'm going to differ a little bit in terms of the way that I think about this. Chasing an even higher or ever higher VO2 max as an end in itself, especially at the extreme endurance athlete level, can come at a real biological cost. Okay, so what I mean by that is we can go a little bit too deep into that pursuit of performance, because VO2 max at its highest level is a performance measure. So what I like to talk about a lot is really, aiming for or paying attention to and aiming for assessment measures that have no diminishing returns. And I get it. There is a high correlation to a decrease in all-cause mortality, the higher our VO2 max is, but we also have to admit that there are diminishing returns in building that VO2 max, the work that it takes to build that VO2 max up to those highest degrees. So things like left ventricle hypertrophy, right? So things like that, right? So there can be diminishing returns. And if we just let that number be the means to an end, I think that we're going the wrong direction. The true pursuit, in my opinion, should be consistency, consistent aerobic capacity, increases of repeatability, low resting heart rate, high heart rate variability or HRV, and the ability to recover and adapt over years, not just spike a lab number for a single test. I'm not really going to get into how we test VO2 max and all of the ways that we do that and how we can kind of game the system a little bit. That's not important. And the point isn't to say that VO2 max is not a good measure. I actually think it's a really good measure, but the intent shouldn't be just push that thing as high as possible. Okay. So performance doesn't always equal health. I know we say that a lot, but that's really, really important to keep in mind. And we program for humans. We don't program to just increase numbers. Okay, now let's get into some frameworks around aerobic training, or starting to build your clients' aerobic bases and peaks, or whatever the goal might be. Framework number one, or thing to consider, is know what aerobic training is. Okay, so at its most simplest and baseline level, aerobic training is the ability to sustain work over time. Okay. If we were to start getting into more physiological definitions of aerobic training, we'd start talking about aerobic metabolism. We'd start talking about oxygen dependent energy production and things like that. And then we'd start talking about things like increasing density of mitochondria and all of that. Let's put that aside for now. We might hit that here in a little bit. But at its base, a baseline definition is the ability to sustain work over time. Okay. So as we start to define aerobic training, or as I define what aerobic training is, just realize that I didn't mention heart rate. I didn't mention any other objective measures other than those subjective measures. Can I sustain over time? We can build objectivity out of that. We can look at things like pace per 500 meters. We can look at wattage. We can look at all of that stuff. But just think about it. Can I sustain this work over time? So that is the baseline definition of aerobic training. Now, to understand what aerobic training is, I think we have to understand what the other two pillars of training are. So that would be strength and anaerobic. So just think about strength as quick acceleration. Think about anaerobics as really pushing red line and really pushing threshold. And there's a little bit of gray area between anaerobic training and aerobic threshold training, and we'll get to that here in a moment. And then when we start to look at aerobics, we're looking at cruise control, we're looking at sustainable output. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about how we're producing energy or how these things are in increasing ATP or anything like that. let's just talk about simply what aerobic training is versus strength and anaerobic training. Okay, so how do we test our aerobic fitness, or how do we know that our aerobic fitness is improving if we're not hyper-focused on VO2 max? The number one thing that I'm going to recommend that you look at when defining and looking at, am I improving my client's aerobic base or aerobic peak, is just look at the work that they're doing. Over an 8-week cycle, you look at week number 1 versus week 8. Are they improving their ability to sustain work? Okay, so that might not have anything to do with the power that they're putting out over that 20-minute time frame, or whatever that time frame is that you're assessing or progressing. Can they just more easily sustain that work over time? Can they prove that they can hold that 155 per 500 meters? Or in week 1, did they hold 155 per 500 meters and they were at like an RPE of like a 7.5? And then by week 8, they're holding the same 155 per 500 meters and the RPE is now down to a 5.5, right? Like just little things like that, more subjective things, or ways that we can understand as if someone is improving their aerobic fitness. Then we can get back to the physiological pieces, right? We can start to look at mitochondrial density. We can look at energy efficiency. We can look at recovery from stress. Okay, so stress can be aerobic training or stress can be strength training, right? Like when we increase our aerobic capacity, or aerobic base, I should say, that spills over into a lot of areas to include strength training. So we'll start to see people recover better between sets of row intervals. We'll start to see people hold a lower RPE over a 30-minute aerobic piece. And we'll even start to see people recover really well between sets on the resistance side of things as well. So that's framework number 1. Just understand what aerobic training is, and maybe more importantly, understand what it's not. Okay, number 2, this concept, understand and implement this concept of polarized aerobic training. So polarized aerobic training just means that we're spending most of the time in either low intensity / long duration work, and we are strategically dosing in amounts of high intensity work. Okay, so we're staying out of that middle zone most of the time. Okay, so we might be doing like 30-second intervals to 4-minute intervals, just as an example, as our higher intensity work. And then our longer duration work, we might be doing 20, 45, 60-minute pieces, and we're just dosing those over time, and we're just staying out of that middle zone. Why do I say stay out of that middle zone? That's just a principle of polarized training, not only in aerobics, but even in strength work, right? Like we want to stay out of the middle zone because it just stresses the system, and it's not really giving us an adaptation that is big enough on one side or the other to be worth the squeeze. Okay, so that concept of like, is the juice worth the squeeze? Okay, so foundational aerobic work, this is where we widen the base. Okay, so this is number 1, foundational work. We're widening the base. Again, I don't like to dig too much into zone training and looking at heart rates very specifically. But if we have to, let's call this work like zone 2 to 3. I'm very specifically not saying zone 1 because zone 1 is just movement. Okay, movement outside of the gym. We go on walks, we go on hikes, we bike with our family, stuff like that. That's zone 1, right? Heart rate is very, very low, very little training adaptation or aerobic adaptation that's coming out of that. We're just moving blood in zone 1. These sustainable long duration sessions are probably zone 2 to zone 3. And if we had to put an RPE to it, it's probably an RPE of like a 2 to 4. Okay. Benefits of this work: endurance and recovery. Again, we'll talk about mitochondrial biogenesis, increasing the density of mitochondria in the cells. We can improve fat oxidation, metabolic flexibility. We can increase our BNF, so increasing cognitive function, improve mood, patience, consistency, and there's all that stuff outside of the gym that honestly, personally, I think is not more important, just as important as cardiovascular development. So the ability to just be patient across a long period of time, because when you do this type of aerobic work, You just have to be extremely patient. So application of this aerobic work, let's call it 2 to 4 times per week. And then what are we doing here? We're doing cyclical, low impact modalities. We're biking, we're using ergs, we're hiking at a really high clip. When I say really, it's just, we're not just like walking, on the side of a mountain. Maybe now we're walking up a mountain, or we're walking with a weighted vest and we're getting that heart rate up into that like zone 2 to zone 3 if we're tracking zones. And that would be, let's call it easy aerobic work or base building aerobic work. Then we get into tough aerobics. And this is what's generally associated with VO2 max improvements. Okay. But I do want to say the base aerobic stuff, or the stuff that we just talked about, the base building easier, quote unquote, aerobic stuff, that has a profound impact on VO2 max improvements. Because when you go and you take a VO2 max test, you'll notice that if that base is really wide, you're testing for like 30-35 minutes before you're actually rolling and that heart rate is increasing. Okay, so density, you're just increasing the density inside of that test. Okay, so tough aerobics, this is the stuff that's usually associated with VO2 max improvement. And what are characteristics of this? Increased stroke volume, increased cardiac output, metabolic rate elevation, so like EPOC. This work can build resilience and build confidence. If done improperly, you can kind of go down that rabbit hole of just building pain tolerance, which we want to stay away from, but it can build a lot of resilience and confidence here. Application of this work, let's just call it like 1 to 2 times per week. And then if, the stars are completely aligned, let's not focus on this specifically until after our aerobic work is built, or our aerobic base is built. We can do intervals here. So example, 4 minutes on, 4 minutes off, 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, times, a number of rounds. That brings us to about, let's call it like 15 minutes of total work across the session. So maybe it's 15 to 25, depending on if you're at those 30-second intervals or those 4-minute intervals. And what are we focusing on here? We're focusing on repeatability, not maximal output per set. Okay, so that is really, really important. Let me give you a quick example and what I mean by repeatability. So what if we're doing 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, and we're doing that times 20 sets? What we would want to see in each one of those 30-second intervals, there's 2 things that we might want to see. Number 1, which is easiest, is we would just want to see sustainable output or repeatability. Okay, so if we're at 275 watts, set 1, we want to hold 275 watts plus or minus a couple across all 20 sets. Okay, so that is repeatability. Or we could also attack this where we're incrementally increasing our paces over those 20 sets. So imagine that you're at 250 set 1, and let's say you hold 250 sets 1 to 5, and then you go up to 270 sets 6 to 10, so on and so forth, and you're just kind of climbing. So it's repeatable because you're able to at least repeat the work that you did before. It's not maximal effort because you're proving that, because you can actually increase your power, and you're actually kind of prepping the system to produce more power over time. So that's a strategy in itself that you can put into those tougher aerobic interval pieces. So that is number 2. And then number 3 is, let's assess and program aerobic work. Okay, I know it might be obvious, or it might sound obvious when I say that we program aerobic work, but it might not be obvious that we do some type of assessment. Okay, so we talked about the VO2 max. Maybe you're not in a lab setting. You can't mask people up, throw them on a treadmill or throw them on a bike, and you don't have the machinery to do that. There's a bunch of options. Create your own aerobic test, right? One that I really like for, longer, quote unquote, a longer aerobic piece that gets us into like some mixed cyclical. So we're using some aerobic power as well, is a simple 50, 40, 30, 20, 10 bike erg calories, and then alternating with row erg calories. So we'd hit 50 on the bike, 50 on the row, 40, 40, 30, 30, 20, 20, 10, 10. A lot of density to start, and then we can start picking up our pace a little bit toward the end there. You'll see some a wide variety of times there, but it should be about, for most people, it'd be about in that 20 to 23, maybe 25 minute range, depending on body weight. Okay, so you can use a test like that, create your own. You can use a time to exhaustion test to just establish a baseline, or you can do a more specific test like a ramp test to identify easy versus tough thresholds. Okay, so when we start to talk about progressing now and actually programming, for you guys that have gone through OPEX CCP, you know what we do there. We have the MAP framework. So maximum aerobic power. We progress from long to short. We move from sustainable to challenging. Always prioritize repeatability over max effort. So just think long to short progressions. Think about 8-week progressions. So to actually put that on paper, it would be like 30-minute intervals. Yeah, that's tough. That's insane, right? 30-minute intervals or a 30-minute set over eight weeks. And then you go down to about 15 minutes and then 10 minutes and then 5 minutes and then going all the way down to 30 seconds. That's just an example of a MAP progression. Okay. A simple progression formula would be, number one, establish 60 minutes of nonstop movement as a baseline to your people before you're even considered or concerned with building their aerobic base power, or even taking them through any type of progression. So if someone can't go outside and walk nonstop for 60 minutes, let's not even talk about progression. Progression for them is just building volume up to 60 minutes of nonstop movement. And the reason why I say that is we can fall into a trap where we're like trying to get these people faster, quicker over time, and they can't even move for 60 minutes to start. Okay. So I know that should sound obvious, but that should be like a baseline, making sure that our people can actually move their bodies for 60 minutes nonstop. And then you would layer those gears. Okay. So the 30 minutes, 20 minutes, 10 minutes, 5 minutes, whatever the case is, you're just progressing them from long to short. And then you can introduce tough aerobic work once that foundation is set. And there's no magic number there, guys. I mean, people might be ready day one. A lot of people are, but a lot of people aren't as well. So make that judgment call. Can your people actually express power on an erg before you're doing like high power erg intervals with them? So just use your best judgment when considering how you're going to progress someone forward there. Now that we have those frameworks, I just want to remind you guys to not just go out there and give people just random cardio or just give them random conditioning and just slap that onto their resistance training plans or wherever they might be doing already. Don't make the same mistake that I made early in my coaching journey when I started getting really interested in energy systems development. So there's been times where I didn't really think about concurrent training principles and I just like slapped this aerobic progression, which would have been good all on its own, but I slapped it right on top of, I don't know, let's just call it like a super high volume hypertrophy program. And those two things just kind of butted up against each other. Okay. So let's not make the mistake of giving people a bunch of random quote unquote conditioning. And let's make sure that we're not giving people good aerobic programs, but just in the wrong scenario or in the wrong environment. And they don't have the environment or they're not doing the things that they need to do outside of the gym to be able to recover and adapt to that aerobic training. And then I'm just going to say, don't get too precise. Okay. So what I mean by that is building out like a 16-week, this is exactly what this person is doing. They're hitting this pace per 500 meters and there's no veering, left or right of this. An aerobic plan is really good, but you need to be agile as your client is adapting or maybe not adapting to your plan. Okay. So don't think that you have to be too precise with these progressions. Again, understand the principles, work within those principles, and adjust within those principles. When did I shift and starting to actually, let's call it use principles in aerobic training? It was James Fitzgerald who really taught me a lot about how to principally structure aerobic progressions. And that's just been an absolute game changer. So having that system as kind of my baseline, and I don't think I'll ever get rid of that baseline, but that baseline has always been there or has been there for the last decade or so, maybe 15 years. And everything that is revealed in terms of like, let's call it like, a white paper comes out and it says this versus that. And I used to think that was correct. Because these principles are already laid, I'm just stacking this on top of the principles that I already know to be true. Okay. So the shift for me is just getting introduced to true aerobic progression through James and then kind of using that as my foundation over time. And as I started to do that, I saw that I was giving people less and I was being more patient with progressions. And that equaled some really good emotional stuff for my clients, but greater recovery, fewer injuries, better mood, higher training consistency. They weren't just like going into the well every single week. And it really influenced how I design personally. And even today when I design, I still coach a few people. Even today when I design, I'm like, be patient, be patient, be patient. And sometimes it might look as if it's boring to that client, but I have to remind myself, as long as I'm connecting that work to that client, I'm giving them context, it won't be, because they'll know exactly why they're doing it. All right, to close this out, I just want to challenge you to pull up your last 3 programs or 3 clients that you program for. And I want you to ask yourself a few questions. Make sure that these are clients that you're actually doing aerobic progressions with, first of all, but ask yourselves 3 questions. Number 1, is aerobic work program with purpose, or am I just adding it for fluff, for volume, for entertainment? Right, number 1. And if your answer is yes on the fluff or volume or entertainment, stop doing that. Be really pointed with your aerobic programming. There is room for, entertainment in a principally sound program, right? Like, I'm not totally against that. But just think about that as question number 1. Number 2, are you building a wide base before you add intensity? So think about that client that you brought in that can't move for 60 minutes nonstop, even if you ask them to. Are you trying to give them hit intervals, right? If you are, stop doing that. Get them moving for 60 minutes before you start to do that, and bring them through that progression, wherever aerobic progression you're using. And then finally, can your client repeat the effort week to week without burnout? Okay, that's really, really important. And that's why we like 8-week progressions for any specific aerobic progression, because it's enough time for your client to prove that they own that gear. Okay, there's nothing magical about 8 weeks outside of it's enough time. Okay, it's enough time. And if you get to 6 weeks and you're like, they've nailed this since week 1, there's nothing wrong with moving on after 6. But we like 8. We found that it's a really principally sound time frame for people to actually accumulate and progress, because usually the first couple weeks is feeling it out. That's going to be it for this episode. Don't treat aerobic work like filler work. Treat it like you're building a foundation, but not only a foundation for their cardiovascular system and all of the things and the benefits that we talked about today, but just as a foundation of life for life. We have to move on a daily basis, and we want to be able to functionally move without having to stop in a lot of areas. So that's the work, and that is the framework. And make sure that you ask any questions wherever you're watching this. Engage. Let's have a back and forth on this, and appreciate it. And I will see you next week.